Moving along as we discuss stress, health, and coping, let's talk a little bit about physical health. We've kind of dabbled in some of the ways that stress can impact the body. And we talked a little bit in the last lecture about how stress can impact the brain, but let's take a closer look here. How do you feel when you're stressed? I want you to think about a time where you've been super stressed and think about what your body has felt like. Do you feel alert? Do you feel happy, positive, tired, drained? Think about some of the different things that you might feel. I almost feel like you're sick sometimes, right? I know when I'm super sick, sometimes I actually even feel like I'm getting sick. Let's take a look at some of the different ways that stress can impact our bodies, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
Cramming for a test? Trying to get more done than you have time to do? Stress is a feeling we all experience when we are challenged or overwhelmed. But more than just an emotion, stress is a hardwired physical response that travels throughout your entire body. In the short term, stress can be advantageous, but when activated too often or too long, your primitive fight or flight stress response not only changes your brain, but also damages many of the other organs and cells throughout your body. Your adrenal gland releases the stress hormones cortisol, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine. As these hormones travel through your bloodstream, they easily reach your blood vessels and heart. Adrenaline causes your heart to beat faster and raises your blood pressure, over time causing hypertension. Cortisol can also cause the endothelium, or inner lining of blood vessels, to not function normally. Scientists now know that this is an early step in triggering the process of atherosclerosis, or cholesterol plaque buildup in your arteries. Together, these changes increase your chances of a heart attack or stroke. When your brain senses stress, it activates your autonomic nervous system. Through this network of nerve connections, your big brain communicates stress to your enteric or intestinal nervous system. Besides causing butterflies in your stomach, this brain-gut connection can disturb the natural rhythmic contractions that move food through your gut, leading to irritable bowel syndrome, and can increase your gut's sensitivity to acid, making you more likely to feel heartburn. Via the gut's nervous system, stress can also change the composition and function of your gut bacteria, which may affect your digestive and overall health. Speaking of digestion, does chronic stress affect your waistline? Well, yes. Cortisol can increase your appetite. It tells your body to replenish your energy stores with energy-dense foods and carbs, causing you to crave comfort foods. High levels of cortisol can also cause you to put on those extra calories as visceral or deep belly fat. This type of fat doesn't just make it harder to button your pants. It is an organ that actively releases hormones and immune system chemicals called cytokines that can increase your risk of developing chronic diseases, such as heart disease and insulin resistance. Meanwhile, stress hormones affect immune cells in a variety of ways. Initially, they help prepare to fight invaders and heal after injury, but chronic stress can dampen the function of some immune cells, make you more susceptible to infections, and slow the rate you heal. Want to live a long life? You may have to curb your chronic stress. That's because it has even been associated with shortened telomeres, the shoelace tip ends of chromosomes that measure a cell's age. Telomeres cap chromosomes to allow DNA to get copied every time a cell divides without damaging the cell's genetic code, and they shorten with each cell division. When telomeres become too short, a cell can no longer divide, and it dies. As if all that weren't enough, chronic stress has even more ways it can sabotage your health, including acne, hair loss, sexual dysfunction, headaches, muscle tension, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, and irritability. So, what does all this mean for you? Your life will always be filled with stressful situations, but what matters to your brain and entire body is how you respond to that stress. If you can view those situations as challenges you can control and master, rather than as threats that are insurmountable, you will perform better in the short run and stay healthy in the long run.
So hopefully what you took away is that stress is very related to a lot of the physical impacts on our body as well. What I don't want is for you to walk away now being stressed about being stressed, right? They talked about the difference between sort of day-to-day stress and that long-term chronic stress. That's what we really want to avoid. The day-to-day stuff is unavoidable. It's that long-term chronic stuff. But think all the way back to when we talked about human development several weeks ago in the semester. I think about the people who are born into poverty or in violent neighborhoods or with food insecurity or housing insecurity, right? Who are the ones who are going to be a lot more likely to have that chronic stress, right? It's the people who sort of live in some of those adverse environments. And then they go on to have the more physical challenges as well, but might not have the ability to confront or to handle it. Okay. That's what we mean when we say stress is cumulative, or this idea of cumulative risk. Everything sort of piles on one another. Okay. So thinking about, and this is just a table from your book, and I'm giving you some of those positive, possible outcomes of stress. Again, I'm not trying to stress you out even more than you already are. If anything, I'm trying to encourage you to recognize what your coping mechanisms are for when you experience stress and help you think through ways to use good adaptive coping mechanisms to help you avoid facing that chronic stress. Okay, let's move on. Now, most of these associations are correlational rather than causal, but we have to interpret them with so we have to interpret them with caution. But let's think of the ways that stress might lead to illness. There's a lot of factors that come in between stress and illness. It's not a direct relationship. There's a whole lot of other pieces to that puzzle. The book suggests that things like personality, physiology, and memory could all influence the relationship between high stress and illness. For example, neuroticism might lead people to view events as stressful and to remember the bad things or remember when they were sick, thus inflating that apparent correlation between stress and illness. Can you think of any others? I can think of several, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. Okay. So if we're thinking about things that sort of impact this relationship, we can think about this is what we would call a moderating relationship. So there's some of these factors which can help us to be not as impacted by stress. One of these is social support. This includes aid and emotional sustenance that are provided by people in our social network. Think about how the people in your life might help you feel better when you're stressed. Maybe it's just sitting with you or listening to you, hearing you out when you need to vent, helping you problem solve, just sort of being there for you in any way that you interpret that. The favorable effects of social support are actually strong enough to have an impact on our mortality. Studies have found that high social support increases people's odds of survival during stressful events by roughly 50%. That's a pretty big deal. There are some cultural differences in the types of social support that people prefer. For example, Americans tend to prefer explicit social support. So stuff that's sort of overt and fairly obvious emotional support and aid from others. Whereas Asian cultures tend to prefer more implicit social support, sort of the comfort that comes from knowing one has access to others who will be supportive. You don't necessarily need to draw on or tap into that support, but you know it's there. Optimism is sort of a general tendency to expect good outcomes. This is that glass half full mentality, which enables things to just kind of roll off you a little bit more, leads to that resilience that we talked about earlier. We don't cover personality in this class, but conscientiousness is one of the big five personality traits. So a conscientious person is really good at self-regulation. They're good at impulse control. This trait influences whether you will set and keep long-range goals, deliberate over choices, behave cautiously or impulsively, and take obligations to others seriously. High conscientiousness is associated with good physical health, increased longevity, and conscientious people are less likely to exhibit unhealthy habits such as smoking and drug use. So that's how it might factor into the relationship between stresses and illness. I already mentioned this a little bit, but another factor moderating the impact of stress on adjustment is social class disparities. Things like low wages, crowded housing conditions, pre-existing medical conditions. Back to that idea of development and cumulative risk. Social class disparities play a huge role in not only stress, but access to resources to help us to cope with that stress. On the flip side, there are some positive sides to stress, believe it or not. We've talked many times about how the human experience is susceptible to evolution. We typically, if we still have an emotion or a characteristic or a trait, it's there for a reason. So stress has some sort of adaptive function. It can actually promote personal growth or self improvement. Much like pressure turns carbon into diamonds, sometimes stress motivates us, lights a fire under us to succeed. Ever find yourself performing just a little bit better when you're stressed or when your back's up against the wall? It's the same idea. But again, think about that Yerkes-Dodson law, right? There's a sweet spot, there's a sort of a peak point. And how well we're able to do this, how well we're able to translate stress into something positive is related to resilience, which we've already talked about. Resilience, if you recall, is that psychological quality that allows some people to be knocked down by the adversities of life and come back, bounce back, at least as strong as before, if not stronger. Rather than letting difficulties, traumatic events, or failure overcome them and drain their resolve, highly resilient people find a way to change course and continue working towards their goals. They're flexible. Like I said, stress isn't always bad. If we were never stressed, we might never learn to appreciate the good things or how to deal with stress if it comes up later in life. A little bit of stress is healthy and normative. It helps us to understand our bodies, how we're feeling. It also helps us to take that step back when we need to. In fact, grappling with some small stressors can help build resilience in the face of future stressors. So I want to take a look at this TED Talk. Here, Kelly McGonigal will talk about the association between stress and a lot of negative outcomes. How can we harness those positive effects of stress? How can we take advantage of those good parts to manage class demands, work, family, or all of the other myriad demands that you face as a student?
I have a confession to make. For years, I've been telling people stress makes you sick, but I've changed my mind about stress. I want to change yours. Let me start with the study that tracked 30,000 adults in the United States for 8 years. And they started by asking people, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, do you believe that stress is harmful for your health? People who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who also believed that stress is harmful for your health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not view stress as harmful, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study. 182,000 Americans died prematurely from the belief that stress is bad for you. I want you all to pretend that you are participants in a study. You come into the laboratory. You have to give a 5-minute impromptu speech on your personal weaknesses to a panel of expert evaluators sitting right in front of you. Now, if you were actually in this study, you'd probably be a little stressed out. Your heart might be pounding, you might be breathing faster. Normally, we interpret these physical changes as anxiety, but what if you viewed them instead as signs that your body was preparing you to meet this challenge? Now, that is exactly what participants were told in a study conducted at Harvard University. And participants who learned to view the stress response as helpful, well, they were less stressed out, less anxious, more confident. Their physical stress response changed. Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile. It's a lot like what happens in moments of courage. We need to talk about a hormone, oxytocin. Oxytocin makes you crave physical contact with your friends and family. It enhances your empathy. Your pituitary gland pumps this stuff out as part of the stress response. And one of its main roles in your body is to protect your cardiovascular system from the effects of stress. Your heart has receptors for this hormone, and oxytocin helps heart cells regenerate from any stress-induced damage. I want to finish by telling you about one more study. This study tracked about 1,000 adults in the United States, and they started the study by asking, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, how much time have you spent helping out friends? People who spent time caring for others showed absolutely no stress-related increase in dying, 0. When you choose to view your stress response as helpful, you create the biology of courage. And when you choose to connect with others under stress, you can create resilience. Thank you.
Kind of cool, right? And so I challenge you all as we move forward to think about ways that you can harness that stress, how you can make it your friend, and how you can sort of flip your way of thinking. This is back to that more positive like mentality, but how can you flip your thinking to take stress, something that we perceive as typically negative, and turn it around to work for you? I love that idea that she talked about at the beginning of, instead of interpreting your stressful emotions as stress, interpret them as your body's way of preparing you to meet the challenge head on. How powerful is that? Now, we all know that some behaviors are healthier than others, and despite our good intentions, sometimes we're guilty of doing the not so healthy thing. Goodness knows I often choose the junk food over the veggies. Okay, but we're all guilty of doing that in some way, shape, or form. So next up, let's chat about some of the behaviors we engage in that might be less beneficial to our health. Smoking is a big one. Got to talk about smoking. Smokers have shorter life expectancy. On average, they live 10 years less than non-smokers. That's pretty substantial. In fact, 66% of smokers die from tobacco-related diseases. Yikes. No, if you are a smoker, I'm not telling you need to run and quit right this second. That might be something good to think about. There's actually lots of programs and support systems for quitting smoking. Before I went to graduate school, I was working in a lab at Rowan's called the Habit Lab. And they do a lot of work on smoking cessation. It's actually really cool. They use applied behavior analysis techniques to help people create behavior plans to help them smoke less. So you'd set a goal, right? If you are smoking, 20 cigarettes a day, they help you set a goal and move from 20 cigarettes to 18 to 16, all the way down to 0, using behavior management techniques and operant conditioning, like we talked about several weeks ago. Really, really cool stuff. Behavior analysis isn't just for kids with autism. Related to smoking is substance use. This is also tied to a whole bunch of physical problems. I won't go too in depth here. I'm sure you've heard this before. And any of you who are taking addictions classes or child and adolescent or lifespan development, you'll hear about this much more. But the gist is that heavy alcohol consumption and use of various recreational drugs increase the risk for disease and subsequent challenges. We're also increasingly finding that exercise is linked to so many health benefits. Things that we didn't even know before. So why might exercise help people to live longer? There's a couple of reasons. One is that an appropriate exercise program can actually enhance our cardiovascular fitness, can reduce susceptibility to some of those deadly heart problems that people experience, like heart attacks. Exercise can also indirectly reduce one's risk for a variety of obesity-related health problems, such as diabetes and respiratory difficulties. The theory being that if you're exercising fairly regularly, you're less likely to be obese. That just makes sense. Recent studies suggest that exercise can help diminish chronic inflation, which is also thought to contribute to quite a few diseases. Exercise serves as a buffer that reduces the potentially damaging effects of stress. So we talked a lot about the physical effects of stress. Exercise might help to mitigate some of those, make them a little bit less. Among the elderly, exercise is associated with a reduction in the brain shrinkage that we typically see starting after age 60, just, as a typical part of development. But we also see a reduction in vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease. So there's even new work coming out that shows that exercise might help decrease the odds of Alzheimer's and dementia, which is so, so major. Exercise experts actually recommend that adults engage in at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise 5 times a week, or 20 minutes of vigorous exercise 3 times a week. Now, again, I'm not trying to stress you out if you don't do those things. Certainly not saying that there's a causal link, just something to think about as we think about ways that we can both decrease stress, but also flip the script and help stress work for us. So that's it for now. In our last section, we will talk about ways that we react to illness. What are some ways that we respond when we know that illness is on the table? I'll see you then.